We begin with the latest on the escalating Israel-Hamas war. Israeli forces waged ground operations against Hamas in Gaza in what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the second phase of the war. The latest, the Israeli Defense Forces said that it struck over 450 terror targets during the past day. It added that the IDF fighter jets struck over 450 military targets belonging to the Hamas terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip. Earlier, speaking at a press conference in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu briefed about the ground invasion and warned that the fighting in Gaza will be long and difficult. He added that defeating Hamas was an existential test for Israel.
אחרי המלחמה, כולם יצטרכו לתת תשובות לשאלות קשות, זה כולל אותי, שהמהלך הקרקעי, שאנחנו הרחבנו אותו, יסייע לנו במשימה הקדושה הזאת. בזה אנחנו עוסקים עכשיו.
The Prime Minister reiterated Israel's call for Palestinian civilians to evacuate the northern Gaza Strip. This comes as Israeli Defense Forces released footage of what it said was the start of a second stage in the war. Israel said troops sent into Gaza on Friday night were still in the field, focusing on infrastructure, including the extensive tunnel network built by Hamas.
הוא 3 שבועות מתחילת המלחמה. למלחמה הזו יש שלבים, היום אנחנו עוברים שלב. כוחות שלנו מבצעים כעת פעילות קרקעית ברצועת עזה. הפעילות הזו מלווה על ידי אש מדויקת וכבדה. אלה נועדו לשרת את כל מטרות המלחמה. פירוק חמאס, ביטחון בגבולות ומאמץ עליון להשבת כל החטופים הביתה. עד כה הצבנו את קו ההגנה. תקפנו. לאויב יש מאות רבות של הרוגים, תשתיותיו מושמדות. המצב בעזה הוא תוצאה של מעשיו הנפשעים של חמאס, שם האחריות.
A tweet by Netanyahu earlier today read that under no circumstances and at no stage was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned of war intentions on the part of Hamas. Meanwhile, military helicopters in the morning flew over Israel's southern city of Ashkelon, which lies just under 20 kilometers from the Gaza Strip. According to Health Ministry in Hamas-run Gaza, they say that war deaths have exceeded 8,000. Health authorities in the Gaza Strip of 2.3 million people say 7,650 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's campaign to obliterate the militants. On top of death and destruction, there's a worsening humanitarian crisis at play. As the ground invasion continues, Israelis are protesting for the immediate release of hostages. Meanwhile, Hamas's leader in Gaza says the group stood ready to make an immediate exchange if Israel freed all the Palestinian prisoners it was holding. While Israel's military says that it has now counted 230 hostages taken to Gaza. The Prime Minister made no commitment to any exchange deal, but assured hostage families that Israel would exhaust every option to bring them home. As Israeli airstrikes continue to devastate parts of the Gaza Strip, these satellite images released by Planet Labs reveal the extent of the damage caused by the daily bombardments in northern Gaza. Dr. Malcolm Davies is a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability at Australian Strategic Institute. He is now joining us live from Canberra, Australia. Doctor, welcome to the show. No international aid entered the Gaza Strip due to the communications blackout created by Israel. What sort of a crisis are we looking at if these blockades, power blackouts, power cuts, resource pauses continue to persist?
Well, look, I think we have to put this in the context that we are looking at a war here. And unfortunately, civilians are caught up in this, primarily because Hamas has refused to allow them to leave the area where the Israelis are going to come in their ground invasion. So we are looking at a very bad humanitarian situation. Israel, I'm sure, will take every opportunity to avoid needless civilian deaths. But the reality is that Gaza is a very densely populated, small area, and there's only so much you can do with precision strike weapons to avoid civilian casualties. So I think it is a very bad situation in terms of the humanitarian impact, and we can only hope that the the risks and the casualties will be as low as possible.
Doctor, there are reports from the health ministry in Gaza that at least 30 hospitals and health centers have shut down in Gaza since Israel started its war on the enclave. Could this be a tactic being used by Israel to try and enforce their notice to Gazans to move out of what they call harm's way or southwards?
I doubt it. Look, I think what you're seeing is essentially hospitals and other services being shut down because of the lack of fuel flowing in to Gaza. And the reason that fuel is not flowing in is because Israel doesn't want that fuel then going to Hamas, which then can use that fuel to support its own war efforts. So I do think that this is an unfortunate circumstance, an unfortunate problem that is being created on the ground. But Israel is not going to essentially give aid to its enemy by providing electricity, fuel, water, that sort of thing, which Hamas would use rather than give to the Palestinian civilians.
White House is pushing for a national security package of around $105 billion for supporting Israel and also Ukraine. Do you think President Joe Biden will succeed in getting these funds? And if he does, will that change the course of the war in any way?
Oh, look, I hope he gets those funds because it's not just about Israel, it's also about Ukraine. And we cannot ignore the war in Ukraine. Ukraine has to win that and decisively defeat the Russians. And so therefore, the US and its allies in Western Europe need to continue to support Ukraine, even as this war in the Middle East gathers pace. I don't think that the aid for Israel is going to dramatically change the course of the war. It will certainly help the Israelis in terms of sustaining military operations, but it's not going to fundamentally change the outcome. I think the Israelis need to launch this war, to go against Hamas, to defeat Hamas, and then ultimately what they need to do once they've defeated Hamas and the other Palestinian terrorist groups that are there that are being sponsored by Iran, the Israelis then need to win the peace. And that means finding some sort of equitable security solution that means that groups like Hamas never reinstate themselves in the region.
Doctor, finally, and I want your brief response to this one. We are seeing now that the UAE has called for a special session of the United Nations Security Council meeting on Monday. There was another session at the United Nations General Assembly where a resolution was passed, and this resolution angered Israel and also angered the United States. Gazans or the Palestinian Authority welcomed the resolutions. These humanitarian agencies, when they meet for these emergency summits or meetings, do they really help in any way?
Well, that UN General Assembly resolution, the reason why the US and others, including Australia, for example, abstained was because it did not acknowledge that Hamas was the instigator of this crisis by launching those attacks on October the 7th. So it was seen as an incomplete resolution. And I think it's not helpful to have these sorts of resolutions at the UN General Assembly that essentially are very one-sided and very biased. So I think if there is going to be another UN meeting at the Security Council on Monday, it needs to be completely unbiased. It needs to recognize that Hamas caused this crisis by launching the attacks on October the 7th against Israel. And it needs to recognize that Hamas is an international terrorist group that's sponsored by Iran. And it can't be a resolution that essentially ignores those facts and tries to pin the blame on Israel.
All right, I've been talking to a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability at Australian Strategic Institute, Dr. Malcolm Davis. Thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.